Chosen one, welcome, miracle in motion. Welcome, warrior with scars that shine like gold. If you're reading this, it's not by accident. It's because destiny handpicked you to rise. Not just to survive, but to walk boldly into a life that no longer matches your past. You've been through things that would have broken 10 others. You've stood in the middle of storms that tried to make a home out of your suffering. And yet, here you are, still standing, still glowing, still chosen. Let's be clear, you are not average. You are not random. You are not forgotten. You are the one heaven whispered about long before the pain began. The one who would outlast the fire, outgrow the chains, and outshine the darkness that tried to silence you. Everything you've endured was not a punishment. It was proof. Proof of your power. Proof of your purpose. And now it's your time. Time to shake off the ashes and walk like someone who knows the old chains have been melted down into crowns. You're not just walking into breakthrough. You are the breakthrough. The curse ends with you. The cycles bow to you. And every demon that thought it had the final word on your life is choking on its own regret. So take a deep breath. Roll your shoulders back. Lift your head like someone who's already won. Because this is not just another chapter. It's the era where you finally see who you really are. Welcome to your rise. Welcome to your redemption. Welcome to the realm of the unshakable, looking for purpose and peace. Hit subscribe and start the journey. The cycle didn't vanish because it grew tired. It collapsed because it found no more room to breathe. Repetition can only survive in hearts still raw, minds still vulnerable to the echo. But once you've passed through the cold steel of hardship and stood where others would have fallen, the wheel grinds to a halt. What once disguised itself as coincidence, a sequence of stings, of repeated endings, was in truth a design made to trap, not test. It wasn't simply about struggle. It was architecture meant to imprison your hope. The ache, the abandonment, the unraveling, they all arrived wearing new names, but shared the same blueprint. Every disappointment was a thread woven from the same intention, to drain your strength until you forgot you had any. But when you didn't break, that architecture fractured. The loop needed your surrender, not your endurance. And when it didn't get it, it expired. That storm wasn't random weather, it was a machine, and it malfunctioned when you refused to power it with despair. Patterns don't vanish quietly. They dissolve when their purpose fails. You didn't just withstand it, you stripped it of meaning. The repetition died not with time, but with your refusal to repeat the reaction it fed on. And so, the torment's grip evaporated, because it needed your participation to survive. Now, it has nothing left to circle back with. You unthreaded the design. The cycle has turned, and the days that once pressed heavily against the spirit have run their course. Suffering, though once present like a storm that overstayed its welcome, was never infinite in nature. It operated within limits, invisible frameworks of time and meaning that were never truly aimless. What felt like relentless weight had, all along, an unseen structure holding it in place, bound to fade once its unseen mission reached completion. If your heart overflows with divine love, now is the moment to let it shine. Click the super thank you button on YouTube and give $10 or more to help carry God's light to others. Your gift will bless not only your life, but countless others. You are part of His sacred plan. Your kindness may be the answer to someone's prayer. Share your blessings and honor His kingdom. May His grace guide you always. The depth of the ordeal didn't come from cruelty, but from timing, an intricate unfolding that required your participation, not your permission. There were understandings to harvest, a certain kind of internal architecture that needed building, quiet fortitude, deep perception, fierce clarity. These weren't qualities that could bloom under mild skies. Once these inner constructions were complete, the hardship began to dissolve, no longer supported by the scaffolding that once kept it tethered to your life. Imagine it less as a punishment and more as a sealed message that, once opened and understood, had no further use. The pressure lifted not by accident, but by design. What felt like coincidence was the quiet enforcement of a spiritual conclusion, one that doesn't broadcast itself with fanfare, but with silence. The silence of a war that no longer needs to be fought. The real deception was always the sense of permanence, the whisper that said you'd always feel this way. That murmur was crafted to weaken resolve, but you walked past it. You reached the threshold. Now the dust settles. The patterns that once haunted you lose shape. What held weight is suddenly weightless. That's not chance, it's a completion. The force that once had reached into your life has lost its authority, displaced by the resilience that grew in its wake. You are not marked by what happened to you. You're marked by the endurance that carried you through. And for that very reason, you won't see those shadows again. That path is closed. That lesson has been learned. That chapter is over. Some carry burdens that don't match their own story, and it's because they were born to be the turning point. When storms come without warning, and the weight feels disconnected from personal choices, it's often because echoes from before have reached forward, looking for someone strong enough to silence them. Wounds don't always begin with the wounded. Across time, pain can be passed like an invisible chain, gathering weight, gathering silence, until someone dares to pull against it. That pull, that resistance, often feels like too much. It distorts the present, making it seem like reality is broken, when in truth, it's a deeper repair taking place. Step beyond the screen. Join and help light the way for others. Cycles hide in plain sight, in repeated losses, in unspoken fears, in patterns no one questioned until now. But the one who faces them isn't just enduring for themselves. They become the border where the past no longer leaks into the future. It's not unfairness, it's selection. The cost feels greater because it includes the debts of voices that never had the strength to speak. The sleepless nights, the unexplained losses, the relentless tension, they weren't arbitrary. They were threads being untangled by hands brave enough to try. And when the unraveling finishes, something extraordinary happens. Everything that came before loses its grip. The repetition ends. The echoes quiet. What comes next isn't weighed down by the same gravity. The legacy shifts. A cleaner sky opens. Not because nothing happened, but because someone stood in the center of what had always been avoided. And they didn't disappear. They didn't bend into the same shape. They stayed, they carried, and they changed everything. From that moment forward, the steps taken are lighter, not by magic, but by payment already made. The toll has been covered, not just for one life, but for all the lives waiting beyond the fire. The chains are no longer bound to the name. What once repeated now dissolves. The line has been rewritten, and freedom walks forward where silence used to live. Some emerge from pain not just intact, but transformed into something unrecognizable to the force that tried to dismantle them. It wasn't just about holding on until the chaos passed. It was about absorbing the chaos and alchemizing it into something invincible. Survival would have been enough for most. But this was reinvention. Wounds didn't just scar, they morphed into intuition. The same moments meant to leave permanent damage instead sharpened inner awareness. Hurt didn't rot the soul, it recalibrated it. Instead of sinking into bitterness, the pain was stripped of its venom and rewired into insight, softness, and inner steel. That kind of shift cannot be undone. What was once an opening for harm has now sealed with wisdom so thick, no familiar attack can enter. The rawness that once made you fragile has turned into a compass. Those empty nights became a forge for truth. The confusion turned into pattern recognition. Every crack was repurposed. What had the power to paralyze now functions as armor, repelling repetition. You aren't walking around the same maze anymore. You dismantled it from the inside. That's the difference between escaping pain and digesting it until it loses its structure. Threats that once could shatter now bounce off. Not because they disappeared, but because you're no longer shaped to receive them the same way. Experience remolded the architecture of your being. The blueprint is altered. Even if familiar shadows try to return, they'll find no home here. What once echoed is now muted by mastery. This isn't immunity through denial. It's evolution through confrontation. The very force that wanted to end you handed you the tools to outgrow its reach. There's no return to the former state. What tried to conquer you has already been disassembled and used to build something permanent. The old patterns? Broken down. Their effects? Neutralized. They're no longer warnings. They're signals of how far you've come. And because of that transmutation, nothing will ever sting the same again. Not because life grows easier, but because you've grown larger than the weight that once seemed immovable. You didn't walk away from the pain. You swallowed it whole and turned it into light. No ambush lasts forever, and when every angle has been exhausted, silence returns, not because the world softened, but because the resistance failed. That relentless surge you survived was not a figment of overthinking. It was the concentrated effort of forces trying to bend what refused to break. It felt like everything erupted at once because it did, not piece by piece, but an avalanche designed to overwhelm. The aim wasn't just disruption, it was complete dismantling. They wagered that if enough pressure collapsed at the same time, there'd be no recovery. But the miscalculation was simple. They never considered what awakens when survival becomes non-negotiable. What surrounded you wasn't coincidence. It was the culmination of every dormant opposition stretching its reach, hoping to make this moment your last. But pressure reveals what cannot be faked. The chaos was supposed to extinguish your fire, yet all it did was reveal its intensity. In trying to end you, they exposed your durability. There's no reservoir of fresh attacks left. When every tactic has been tried and failed, repetition is all that remains, and repetition loses its edge when it's met with recognition. The illusion of infinite weapons was just that, an illusion. And now it's clear. The noise was never meant to be permanent, only persuasive enough to make you surrender early. But you didn't. That matters more than they expected. They bet everything on your collapse and lost. Now, no matter how familiar the threats may look, they hold no real weight. They've already been used. What was intended to consume you has instead confirmed you. You are no longer at risk from what you've already dismantled under pressure. If your heart overflows with divine love, now is the moment to let it shine. Click the super thank you button on YouTube and give $10 or more to help carry God's light to others. Your gift will bless not only your life, but countless others. You are part of His sacred plan. Your kindness may be the answer to someone's prayer. Share your blessings and honor His kingdom. May His grace guide you always. Survival, in this case, wasn't passive. It was the resistance that rewrote the outcome. That chapter is closed, not because the challenge disappeared, but because it spent its final breath and found you still breathing. There's no sharper blade left to strike. The fire is out, and you're still standing. That changes everything. Some don't just endure storms. They rise above the altitude where those storms can even form. What used to feel like a direct hit now barely grazes awareness. Not because the world became gentler, but because the one who lived through it shifted realms entirely. Survival didn't just protect what was sacred. It rewired the very frequency on which danger once reached them. What once stirred reaction now meets indifference. The repetition of old games has no grip anymore. Not because they've changed, but because you have. Familiar faces, familiar patterns, familiar traps. They're still where they've always been. But you're not. You moved. You evolved. You no longer respond from the same posture of need, confusion, or fear. The bait still dangles, but the hunger is gone. Those who once held sway may still try their methods, repeating strategies that used to work. But their influence echoes into a space you no longer inhabit. Their reach is short. Their effect is fading. It's like shouting into a hallway after the door has already closed. That's the shift survival gave you: elevation. Not just above the pain, but above its access. What would have once unraveled your balance now feels almost distant. What formerly ignited anxiety now appears as nothing more than a flicker. This isn't detachment, it's transformation. The tether has been cut. Attempts to drag you back into those emotional depths now feel like chasing a shadow that doesn't cast anymore. And this isn't luck. It's evidence. Evidence that your foundation has changed. Evidence that who you were before the hardship is no longer the one walking forward. The atmosphere around you has thinned out. Only truth can survive here. Manipulation suffocates in this space. Deception can't breathe. You've become inaccessible to the frequencies that once haunted your peace. No return is possible, not because the past is gone, but because you've become incompatible with it. That's why provocation falls flat. That's why pain struggles to find an entrance. You left the old version of you in the ashes, and nothing from that layer of life can follow where you've gone. There comes a moment when instinct replaces hesitation, not out of fear, but from cellular memory. After surviving what seemed unthinkable, the soul forms new defenses, ones that don't ask for permission before responding. That's how pain reshapes, by carving permanent boundaries in the unseen parts of us. Early on, the wounds went unnoticed until they bled. The dangers arrived wearing kindness, and the damage often introduced itself as comfort. That vulnerability wasn't failure. It was the absence of prior experience. But after enduring it all, the soul reorganized itself into something more discerning. It doesn't ask if something is safe. It senses when it's not. Now the shift is automatic. What once required deep reflection now sparks instant recognition. The patterns are no longer seductive. They're transparent. The tricks are too loud. The words are too sharp. Every encounter carries a familiar fingerprint, and your spirit knows how to read them. Not with suspicion, but with clarity. Not with walls, but with wisdom. This transformation isn't reactive. It's evolutionary. What tried to consume you unknowingly programmed your immunity. And immunity doesn't mean you never feel again. It means you no longer absorb what used to infect. The responses come faster. The boundaries feel native. What once crept in now gets stopped at the gate without fanfare. Nothing was wasted. Not the heartbreak, not the confusion, not even the moments of silence. All of it became data. All of it became instruction. Your system learned how to block the very toxins that once slowed you down. Even regret has fewer places to hide. Even nostalgia knows where it isn't welcome. This is what post-trauma strength becomes, not force, but filtration. The signals are no longer ignored. The red flags are no longer excused. What once shattered you now can't even bend you. The danger hasn't disappeared, but your alignment with it has. And now, the greatest protection of all isn't something you build. It's something you are. Some become untraceable to darkness, not because they escaped without harm, but because what should have silenced them carved something eternal into their being. What was meant to erase them ended up becoming their signature. An imprint that declared not defeat, but invincibility. Survival didn't just allow continuation. It branded undeniable evidence into the very fabric of their soul that they had faced destruction and dismantled its reach. The ambushes weren't subtle. They were direct, layered, and calculated to take breath, will, and direction. But the moment they were walked through and not succumbed to, something irreversible happened. A mark was formed, not seen with eyes, but known by every realm that once thought it had dominion. And that mark is a silent force that now follows them, repelling what once tried to devour. This seal doesn't flash or shout. It lives in how resistance now recoils, how old storms scatter before arrival, how traps fail to activate. The ones who carry it need no explanation. They walk differently, not with arrogance, but with a quiet immunity that life seems to recognize. They've earned a kind of spiritual clearance, not from ritual or perfection, but from enduring what was designed to be fatal. Opposition senses it now. Attempts once sharp enough to pierce now dull on contact. Their timeline can't be infiltrated the same way. It's guarded by the memory of what failed to break them. That failure cost the darkness more than expected. It forfeited its access. Once it couldn't destroy, it lost the right to continue. Every step forward now sends an echo, a message into the atmosphere that says, this ground has already been tested. This path is sealed with survival. And that survival, it speaks louder than declarations ever could. The seal they carry isn't an award, it's a witness. A silent, blazing truth that they are unreachable to what once tried to own them. And from that moment on, they became untouchable, not by avoidance, but by triumph carved into their very existence. There are those who weren't supposed to recover, let alone rise. They're the ones whose journey rewrites expectation, not because they wanted to be strong, but because collapse refused to be their ending. The weight of what they endured didn't just challenge them. It defied everything that history says a person can survive. It wasn't just one trial. It was layers of heaviness, placed back to back, designed to fracture every sense of self. The kind of unraveling that most only speak about in hushed tones. But somehow, instead of breaking into irreparable pieces, something else formed in that pressure. A contradiction no one could predict. They became the figure that doesn't make sense to logic. Still moving, still breathing, still building in places where ruins were expected. The very sight of them unsettles narratives, that once dismissed them as finished. And that's what shifts reality around them, because people remember the forecast, and what they see now was never in it. The breakdown was supposed to be the last chapter, but instead, a sequel began, one no one knew was possible. The power structures, the judgments, even the enemies that counted them out. None of it anticipated resilience that refused to vanish. And now, that defiance has rewritten the terms. What was labeled as impossible is now walking around in flesh. What was supposed to remain buried now breathes louder than ever. Their life alone causes silence to fall in places that once mocked them. Not because they became loud, but because their presence alone says, I survived what should have erased me.